It's a pleasure to take some time today, this morning, to take a quick glance back at traceability over the years to see how we got to this point in time. As I put the information together, I certainly acknowledge that we've covered a lot of ground, and I agree with Keith Rohr's comment from yesterday that it's easy to say we're talking about this for 10 more years yet again. But if we actually compare where we were, we've made a lot of progress. So the work and effort over the past generations, I think, has proven beneficial, certainly a learning progress, but we're not at the end of the solution yet, so we've got more progress to make. We've had multiple efforts along the way. For the most part, I think producers support traceability from an animal disease standpoint. They recognize the need for traceability. And the traceability objectives from a program standpoint have been consistent. We want to do it more timely and more complete. The issues of concern, whether it's cost, confidentiality, liability, speed of commerce, we had these same issues of concern 20 years ago, and we'll probably have them 20 years from now. The differences of opinions, however, is what I think causes us to slow the rate of progress. You know, animal ID traceability is a very simple subject. There's a lot of experts. We all know how we want to identify cattle. We all know to what degree we want to trace cattle in our own minds. But when we get two of us together, we have differences of opinions. So we have to compromise to make progress. I want to trace forward on traceability activity initiatives from April 2002 in the United States. So April 2002, this organization established a Food Animal Identification Task Force representing 30 organizations across the country, prepared the National Identification Work Plan. That was really what traces back today from ADT, this initial work plan that was developed at that point in time. That draft document was presented at an ID Info Expo in mid-2002. That fall, it was presented to the ID Committee at U.S. Animal Health. They passed a resolution, unanimous resolution, requesting that USDA accept that document as a preliminary plan for the implementation of a national animal identification system. The main focal point, or the cause at that point in time for industry folks to take this by the horns and run with it, was the recognition that the volume of official ID in the United States was decreasing, as well as the observation of what was happening around the world. In the spring of 2003, USDA formalized that working group effort into the National Animal Identification Team. USDA developed a structure that made it acceptable with rules and regulations by making a subcommittee that reported to the Secretary's Advisory Committee that allowed industry folks to be part of that subcommittee. So this wasn't just a government initiative. Even at this point, there were industry folks around the table. We got up to 100 individuals from 70 organizations. The development team had 5 subgroups, all the way from communication, governments, and standards, similar to what we're looking at today, but we also had species subgroups, so we could, even though it was across the board on multiple species, there was still expertise from all the individual species. From that effort materialized the U.S. Animal Identification Plan. It maintained the original goal of the development team to achieve traceback, complete traceback in the event of a disease in 48 hours. That was the optimal goal. USAIP, if you look at the document today, you'll see some standards that were developed at that point in time to take advantage of standardization. We recognized way back in the beginning that the standardization for animal ID, group lot ID, premise ID, event codes. What's an event code? Tag allocations, tag sightings, tag applied, sightings. All of those were event codes that were established in our original USAIP document. Give me some water. We looked at recognizing that to achieve 48-hour traceback, you're not going to do it overnight. So they certainly acknowledge that it's a phase-in approach. Premises ID, individual group lot ID for the animals, and then a separate component focused on movement tracking. So some key components of USAIP that I think we should take notice of. We included all livestock that left the farm, not just interstate movements. The very original work plan said for cattle, electronic ID in the left ear as the basic method of identification. ID trigger points that initiate the requirement for ID, change of ownership, commingling, and interstate movements. Interstate or animal movements. It really was an interesting point of discussion, probably the most controversial on how to achieve animal movement recording. To minimize the amount of reporting structure, the group said, let's do single reporting, and they focused on the producers that have animals moving into their premises be the ones responsible for reporting that movement, hoping that we would achieve an adequate level of traceability. At that point in time, USAIP was well underway when we had the first confirmation of a positive BSE case that we're all familiar with. When Secretary Veneman at that time announced actions that were being put in place to address the BSE issue, she also announced that USDA would expedite the implementation of a national identification plan. So it was really good timing, the proactive thoughts of industry groups getting together to bring that USAIP forward. To this point in time, it was pretty well advanced, to be real honest. USDA accepted those recommendations that were brought forward through the USAIP document and basically changed the cover to NIAS, National and Animal Identification System. So all what was achieved at that point in time through the efforts of the industry, state and federal animal health officials was highly utilized in the announcement of the National Identification Program. At that point in time, we maintained the goal to achieve traceback in 48 hours. Again, the USDA adopted most of the USAIP standards and most of the processes. One of the points of interest that was not well received, including by myself, was the change to technology neutral. And it was probably a decision that was made with the correct thought in mind, but probably not recognition of how the cattle industry works out in the field. But we dealt with technology neutral, but the subcommittee, including the producer groups that were still on the subcommittee, wanted to go on record opposing technology neutral position of USDA, acknowledging that technology standards be established by industry species working groups, and that the technology standard include support for 48-hour traceback, cost effective, and most specifically, automate the process so not to impede the flow of livestock through marketing channels. NAIS, in the implementation plan that was developed, some key points: mandatory ID, mandatory premises ID by January 2008, and mandatory reporting of the identified movements at that point in time was to take place in January 2009. One of the topics that took on a lot of discussions was this database issue that continues to be a lively point of discussion. But I think it was even more so because the third phase-in effort was the tracking component. And as people looked at the tracking component from different angles, including that of profitability of a service, it got quite political. The original desire was to have a centralized private database, but as we moved forward, Secretary Johans at the time announced the implementation of private and state databases that would hold the animal movement information, where state and animal health officials would have access to the information, not the database, but to the information. As we look at, and these are the events that triggered the opportunity for animal health officials to have access to that information. But on the right hand of the slide is the animal tracking databases. These were not databases that were developed solely to track animals. They were existing databases for process verification programs, DHIA processing dairy record programs, state programs, ICVI, electronic ICVI providers signed up to support the cause on traceability as an animal tracking database. In doing so, in their agreement, we established they would provide access to an animal health official in those events that are listed and make a response to any inquiry within 1 hour. So those dotted lines from ATPS, the Animal Trace Processing System, was a messaging system that went out with the animal number that folks were looking for to those animal tracking databases. And if they had information on that animal, they would electronically message back the information that was specifically established. The data standards for the messages was established. That part was put in place and well developed by 2006 plus or minus. But at that point in time, we had a lot of discussions about concerns of ADT, and the front end of ATPS, Animal Trace Processing System, that allowed animal health officials to log on was never developed. But we looked, when we went from a centralized database concept to a distributed one, I was one that was not supportive of that decision. But after seeing the work that went into this, the technology folks that came around the table, including the industry folks from the animal tracking databases, the processes, the protocols they put in place, I don't think an animal health official would have known if those databases were centralized or distributed based on the concept that had been developed at this point in time. Sorry to say, as NIAA didn't continue to move forward, this effort was put on hold, but I bring this to everybody's attention because I don't think it needs to be forgotten as we move forward. So in NIAA, we had many twists and turns. Even the guys that supported NIAA gave up on trying to following what direction we were going from 1 month, one period of the year to another. There were legitimate concerns. I, for one, admit that I think we were trying to get too big too fast. We scared the heck out of people. Misinformation, we lost the battle. A lot of people were convinced that if you signed a prejudice registration application form, you relinquished your property rights for that farm. And I had not a lot of debates, but I had some folks that seriously believed we were going to microchip chickens. So overall, and saying it in a polite way, NIAA was not well received in some sectors of the livestock industry or general public. So in 2009, Secretary Vilsack said, we're going to go back to square one and we're going to listen from across the country what the beef is about traceability in NIAA. We had listening sessions. Some of you were at those listening sessions. But he made it very clear. We were not going to walk away from traceability. We wanted to solve it. We didn't get very many recommendations at the listening sessions on how to solve it, but we got a lot of complaints. But in February 2010, Secretary Vilsack announced that NIAA would discontinue for a new approach, referenced as the Animal Disease Traceability Framework. As you know, we then changed the focus of all the animals only to a sub-part of the population, those that move interstate. Wise decision, I think, that gained a lot of support for ADT was the administration of the program, especially the information at the state level and tribal nations, to increase the flexibility, encourage the use of low-cost technology. We went from one extreme to the other, but it was the cost of the front end. And we'll have some more discussions, I'm sure, throughout the day on this, and we've had a lot of discussions over the past year and a half about going this way. I look back now and I say, while I again didn't support this move, to be real honest, I think it was a wise one, because I think as we said, okay guys, we want cheap tags, make it work. And now for the last year and a half, we're hearing guys say they don't work. They're looking for better solutions. Rulemaking through the federal rulemaking process. So the rule was developed and published early 2013. Again, livestock moving interstate require official ID, an ICVI, Interstate Certificate of Veterinary Inspection, or other movement document unless otherwise exempt. So ADT, you know, in NAIS, I was there. Every month, well, about every week, we reported on how many premises were being registered. Didn't give much care about what its impact was on traceability, but we were counting premises registrations from a program perspective. When we moved to ADT, I think it was very appropriate that we look at it more from a performance perspective. What are we doing to increase our ability to trace? So trace performance measures were established, measures of activities that state folks, federal folks take when they need to conduct a trace, measuring how quick we can find the record, how completely we can find the records, and putting those in measurables that we can compare and summarize year by year. This is a picture, I think, that reflects significant progress that was made across the entire country, supporting that objective of more timely, more complete information by moving from paper-based systems to electronic. In late 2016, early 2017, USDA kept their commitment to do an assessment of ADT as it was implemented. While I'm biased, I still report that I feel the program, the document, the assessment clearly demonstrated that given the framework that we were to work within, the program was being implemented successfully. If an animal was officially identified, we could find where that animal was tagged. If it moved interstate, we could, at a high level, retrieve the ICVI that would reflect the ship from and ship to premises. So kudos to the state animal health officials and federal folks across the country for making that type of improvement, because I think it was very significant. However, we realized, given the framework, there were issues outside the framework that were causing gaps. We talk about a bookend system, and I told Glenn yesterday, I wish we'd never used that term, because we really didn't implement a bookend system. I think most people think of a bookend system as birth premises, and that's not what we did. So we acknowledged that many cattle were still outside the scope because of the requirement for interstate only. We didn't get the birth premises identified because the animal might move 2, 3, 4 times before it moves interstate, where it's then officially identified. We recognize that if we want to capture this information at the speed of commerce, we need electronic solutions, and we need to do in some parts of in some of the plants a better job on collection of the ID at slaughter. So we put all of this together and look at it at some points I think that are significant in looking at the adjustments from the National Identification Work Plan to USAIP to NAIS to ADT. We started with all livestock, cover them all. And then we got nice and said only if they move interstate. We started with a solution that wanted to identify them at the birth premises, and then we changed it to point of tagging. We went from electronic ID for cattle to technology neutral to low cost. I wish those arrows would have pointed the other way. We accommodated the database issue, I think, for the most part, from going to a centralized national database by federal governments to one of a more distributed one. And at this point in time, I think we need to acknowledge that across the country, many of the states have a very mature animal health database that supports traceability. I'd say between two different database platforms, 45 plus of the states are using the same system. So we do have the opportunity to improve on compatibility or data sharing across the country quite easily. We tried to address the PIN issue by incorporating LIDs, location identifiers, that same principle, only they're administered entirely at the state level. And we had to accommodate additional numbering system because a 15-digit number probably isn't ideal for visual tags only. Some lessons learned that I think are significant, ongoing challenges. Ideal solutions may not be practical. Too big, too fast can be a game loser. We're too big of an industry to have one size fit all. Accommodating every concern across the country creates gaps. And I'd say ADT, we did a heck of a good job responding to the concerns of the industry and producers and animal health officials, all the concerns. But in so doing, we ended up with a lot less than we wanted. Flexibility increases confusion, but we wanted flexibility. We realized too much flexibility can make it very complicated to understand what's what. But to a certain degree, we have to understand that there are options from one part of the country to another that are necessary and justifiable. Standards, I agree with Julie. Standardization of whether it's database issues, data elements, ID devices, it's critical. Unless we're going to build walls and barriers around each state and keep our cattle within your state, then you can do what you want. But if we're going to have free commerce across the country, and we want it to work at the speed of commerce cost effectively, we better have compatibility and standardization. Minimize the data collected. I think we scare people when we talk about the database issues. I think they visualize we're going to keep records of everybody and their brother and everything about them. We don't need much information for traceability. Location, event, date. And I think the databases that we have across the states at the state level very adequately handle most of that information already. One of my observations is the efficiency of getting back in our ADT system to document where an animal was tagged. So a producer orders tags, whether it's from a AIN manager or a tag manufacturer themselves, they have to give them the PIN number. They have to have a PIN to get an 840 number. Some of you might not agree that that's essential, but I think it's critical. If we don't know where the number went, we don't have any value in the tag number if we don't know where it's at. Some manufacturers, when they ship that tag out of the warehouse, their system automatically reports to the animal management system the premises those numbers went to. And if that's a production premises, it's assumed that's the point where the animal's tagged. There might be some exceptions, but it's highly correlated. The point I'm making is nobody has to report nothing beyond that to determine where that animal was tagged at. We don't need birth date. We don't need calving information. That starts our traceability to that point of the premises. In our trace performance measures, we show that within less than an hour, we can retrieve the accurate premises information at a high percentage of the time. I bring that to everybody's attention because I think if we try to get too much information collected, we're going to scare people again. they are not going to want to report a whole lot of information. Electronic ICBIs are part of the equation, a lot of emphasis on electronic ICBIs. I think it's critical that we continue to prioritize electronic certificates. But I think we would get more uptake from the accredited veterinarians if they read the number electronically and read it into the electronic certificate versus recording it manually and then putting it into an electronic system. They're not very keen on typing numbers into an electronic system. So again, I think it goes hand in hand, electronic tags, electronic systems. So from my perspective, looking ahead, I encourage us to continue to build on the ADT framework. Let's not change horses at this point in time. Let's keep going in the same direction. Fix current traceability gaps that have been identified, address major concerns, and make sure that we work with a solution that works at the speed of commerce. I think it's a proper undertaking that we define speed of commerce, but most importantly, that we come up with an objective, measurable performance standard, something that can actually be measured so we can tell producers what to expect from these tags and readers. Never before have we had more information available to support our decision-making process and considerations. I mentioned the ADT assessment report. We have a lot of feedback from the public meetings held throughout 2017, 14-point proposal report that was published by USDA recently. How many of you are aware of this document? Not enough of you. We spent 2017 taking into consideration the feedback from the public meetings, and we had 18 of the best minds across the country from animal health officials at the state and national level that were very keen on traceability, meeting together to address the gaps in traceability, the issues of concern, and they've come back with 14 ideas, proposals, suggestions for you all to consider as you look at your role in ADT, to consider if that's a possible solution for some of the issues that were identified as gaps and issues of concern. That document is on the traceability website, and I certainly encourage your review of that document because I think it helps focus on, from an animal health disease traceability perspective, what the animal health officials have identified as possible solutions for those issues that have been identified. Those meshed with industry feedback and concern and uptake, I think, is a tremendous opportunity. NCBA feasibility study, and certainly the cattle traceability working group. Guys, I appreciate the focus you bringing to the table, action-oriented. I actually look forward to being part of that traceability working group in the future. So a saying that I've said when I started this line of work, before I worked for government, while I worked for government, and I continue to say it after working for government, everybody needs to get on the bus if you want to head towards Traceability USA. But the industry must drive the bus. We need everybody's cooperation, from animal health officials, state, federal, markets, collaborative effort, and we've done a lot, I think a great job in the past. We've got to continue that. But if this is going to work, industry, producers have to take the ball and run with it. And I think we need to encourage more producers that are supportive of this venture to get more vocal. Because if we don't, I don't think Jack Shear and others are going to get the type of feedback that they're going to need to help push this along at the federal level. So thank you all very much. From a retired grandpa, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this morning.